Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The sun hung low in the sky as a group of friends, Emma, Jake, Claire, and Ryan, trekked through the rugged wilderness. Their goal was simple: spend a weekend disconnecting from the world. Emma, the planner, had scouted the remote trail weeks ago. Jake, the jokester, carried the heavy pack with an exaggerated groan, while Claire, quiet and observant, stayed close to the rear. Ryan, their self-proclaimed adventurer, took the lead, always seeking the next thrill. "This trail is barely on the map," Ryan said, his voice tinged with excitement. "We're basically explorers." "Explorers with aching feet," Jake shot back, earning a chuckle from Emma. They had been hiking for hours, weaving through dense trees and rocky outcrops, when Claire noticed something odd. "Hey guys, do you see that?" She pointed to a shadowy opening at the base of a cliff ahead. The group gathered around, peering into the entrance of what appeared to be a cave. "Whoa," Ryan said, pulling out his flashlight. "This is awesome. Let's check it out." Emma hesitated. "We don't know how deep it is. It could be unstable." "Or filled with treasure," Jake added with a grin. After some debate, curiosity won. Flashlights clicked on as they stepped into the cool, damp cave. The air smelled of earth and stone, and the faint drip of water echoed through the space. Then they saw the drawings. Covering the walls were crude ancient depictions of humanoid figures. The figures were tall, with elongated arms and jagged faces, chasing smaller, human-like figures. The style was primitive, yet something about the proportions felt unnervingly deliberate. "Looks like a hunting scene," Claire murmured, stepping closer. "These figures, they're not human." Ryan moved his flashlight over the drawings, revealing more of the macabre story. The creatures had crude weapons, spears, clubs, and their prey seemed terrified, fleeing in every direction. A chill ran through Emma as she studied one particular figure, a humanoid crouching in the shadows, its hollow eyes staring back at her. Jake, attempting to lighten the mood, joked, "Looks like we found Bigfoot's art gallery." Claire frowned. "I don't think this is a joke." Ryan snapped a few pictures with his phone. "These drawings must be thousands of years old. This is amazing." But Emma couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. "We've seen enough," she said. "Let's get back before it gets dark." Reluctantly, the group agreed. They exited the cave and made their way to the campsite they'd set up earlier. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. As they unpacked their gear and started a fire, the cave began to feel like a distant memory, but not for long. As night fell, the fire crackled and cast flickering light across the group. Jake lounged with a grin, poking at the flames with a stick. Ryan scrolled through the photos he had taken in the cave, his excitement undiminished. "These are insane," Ryan said, holding up his phone for the others to see. "Look at the detail on these figures, the way they're posed. It's like they're mid-movement." Emma glanced at the screen reluctantly. The figures seemed even more unsettling in the cold glow of the phone's display. The elongated limbs, hollow eyes, and sharp tools in their hands gave the creatures an unnatural, predatory aura. "You know, the whole thing feels too vivid," Claire said, leaning in, "like someone was trying to tell a story." Jake laughed. "Yeah, a bedtime story for psychopaths." Ignoring him, Claire continued, "It wasn't just a hunting scene. There was something ritualistic about it. Did you see the symbols around the edges, like carvings framing the drawings?" Emma nodded. "I noticed those too. They reminded me of runes, but rougher." Ryan swiped to another photo, zooming in. "Look at this one. The way it's etched, it almost looks—" He paused, tilting his head. "Almost looks what?" Emma asked. Ryan hesitated. "Different. I swear the pose of this creature wasn't like this when we were in the cave." Claire stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look," Ryan said, passing the phone around. "This one wasn't leaning forward like that, and its arm, it wasn't reaching toward the prey." Emma stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The figure Ryan pointed out did indeed appear to be in a hunting stance, its long arm outstretched, claws almost touching the smaller human figures. She distinctly remembered this figure from the cave. It had been upright, arms at its sides. "That's not possible," she said softly, though doubt crept into her voice. Jake scoffed. "You're all just tired. Nobody remembers every little detail of a stupid cave drawing." Claire shook her head. "No, he's right. That figure wasn't reaching out before." Ryan sat back, his excitement now tinged with unease. "I'm not making this up. I know what I saw." The group fell into an uneasy silence. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees pressing against the edges of their firelight. Every sound, the crackle of flames, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified in the stillness. "Maybe we just need some sleep," Emma suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's been a long day." Ryan nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, maybe you're right." The group settled into their tents, the fire burning low. But as Emma lay awake, staring at the shadows cast on the fabric of her tent, she couldn't shake the image of those drawings. The hollow eyes of the figures seemed to follow her, their predatory postures burned into her mind. Her phone buzzed. She reached for it and saw a message from Ryan. "Come outside. You need to see this." Emma's heart sank as she unzipped her tent and stepped into the cool night air. Emma stepped into the night, her breath catching as the cold bit at her skin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the clearing. Ryan stood near the edge of the campsite, his phone in hand, and his face pale in the dim glow of the screen. "What is it?" she whispered, careful not to wake the others. Ryan didn't answer right away. He simply handed her the phone, his hands trembling. Emma took it and stared at the screen. It was one of the photos he had taken in the cave earlier, but something was off. The humanoid figures were no longer just hunting their prey. They were staring directly at the camera. Emma's pulse quickened as she studied the image. The creatures' hollow eyes now seemed alive, their jagged mouths twisted into something resembling grins. One of the figures had moved significantly closer to the foreground, its elongated fingers stretching toward the edge of the photo. This isn't real," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "You edited this, right? Tell me you edited this." Ryan shook his head vehemently. "I didn't touch it, I swear. I just looked through my photos again, and they weren't like this before." Emma's stomach churned. "Maybe it's a glitch, something with the phone?" "Then why aren't the other photos affected?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. "It's just the ones from the cave." A rustling sound came from behind them, and they both whipped around. It was just Jake, emerging groggily from his tent. "What's going on?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Ryan hesitated, then handed Jake the phone. "Look at this." Jake squinted at the screen, his usual cocky demeanor evaporating as he processed what he was seeing. "Okay, that's creepy as hell. Did you guys mess with this or what?" Emma cut in. "We didn't. Something's wrong with these photos." Jake handed the phone back quickly as if it burned his hand. "Well, whatever it is, it's giving me the creeps. Maybe we shouldn't have gone into that cave." "No kidding," Ryan muttered, pacing. "This can't just be a coincidence. Something's happening." Claire joined them, drawn by the hushed voices. Her calm, analytical demeanor was a small comfort as she studied the photo. "If this isn't a prank, then we need to go back to the cave tomorrow. We need to figure out what's going on." Emma shuddered. The thought of returning to that place made her skin crawl, but she couldn't deny Claire had a point. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "But first thing in the morning, we're not wandering around in the dark." The group exchanged uneasy glances before retreating to their tents again. Ryan, however, stayed awake, staring at his phone. He scrolled back to the other photos, his dread mounting with each passing second. The figures weren't just staring now. In the latest photo, one of them had stepped out of the drawing entirely. The morning light did little to ease the tension in the group. The fire had long since burned out, leaving behind cold ashes. No one had slept well. Ryan looked pale and hollow-eyed, clutching his phone as if it held answers he couldn't comprehend. Emma, Claire, and Jake moved stiffly, each feeling the weight of what they'd seen the night before. "We need to figure out what's going on," Claire said firmly, breaking the heavy silence. If the drawings changed once, we need to see if they've changed again. Assuming they're even still there, Jake muttered. His usual humor had evaporated, replaced by unease. The group packed up quickly and made their way back to the cave. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the only sounds their footsteps crunching over dried leaves and the occasional bird call. The path to the cave felt longer this time, as if the woods themselves were reluctant to let them return. When they reached the cave's entrance, Emma hesitated. The dark opening yawned before them, the faint damp smell wafting out like a warning. "Let's just get this over with," Ryan said, stepping inside first. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the rough stone walls. The drawings were still there, but they had changed again. The group froze as their lights swept over the walls. The humanoid figures were now unmistakably different. Where before they had been hunting generic human shapes, the drawings now depicted 4 distinct people. One had a ponytail like Emma's, another wore a hat just like Jake's. The crude figures bore uncanny resemblances to the group. "That's us," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The figures were positioned in a new scene, standing in the cave, holding flashlights. Surrounding them were the elongated creatures, their limbs twisted grotesquely as they loomed closer to their prey. "This isn't possible," Emma said, her voice rising. "How can they—" Ryan interrupted. "There's more." He directed his flashlight farther down the wall. The next section of drawings showed the group running, with the creatures chasing them. The final scene depicted the campsite, down to the fire pit, the tents, and even the log Jake had been sitting on the night before. The creatures surrounded the campsite, their hollow eyes watching from the darkness. Jake swore under his breath. "I don't like this. I don't like this at all." "We need to leave," Claire said, her calm veneer cracking. "We need to leave this area right now." Ryan hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. What if there's more? What if these drawings— "Ryan," Emma snapped, grabbing his arm. "We're leaving, now." The group turned to leave, but as they neared the cave's entrance, Emma's flashlight flickered. For a brief second, the beam danced across the floor, illuminating something new. A single humanoid figure had been drawn near the entrance. It stood alone, its head cocked unnaturally to the side, as if watching them leave. The hike back to the campsite was tense and silent, broken only by the crunch of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Each of them felt the oppressive weight of what they had seen in the cave. The air seemed heavier, the shadows beneath the trees darker. Jake was the first to break the silence. "Okay, I'll say it. This is screwed up. We should have never gone in there." "No one's arguing with you," Emma replied, her voice strained. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of the twisted figures from the drawings following them. "We need to leave the forest," Claire said firmly. "Now. Pack up and get out before it gets dark." Ryan hesitated. "What if leaving doesn't solve anything? What if this, whatever it is, follows us?" Jake stopped in his tracks, glaring at Ryan. "Are you saying we should just sit here and wait for those things to show up? You saw the drawings. They were surrounding our campsite." "Stop," Emma snapped. "We're all freaked out, but fighting isn't going to help. Let's just get back to camp, regroup, and figure out what to do." The group trudged on, but the tension among them was palpable. When they reached the campsite, the unease only grew. The clearing felt different somehow, off. The tents were exactly as they'd left them, but the air seemed colder, and the silence was deafening. As they began packing up, Ryan stopped and held up his phone. "Wait. What now?" Jake snapped. "I need to go back to the cave," Ryan said, his voice resolute. "There's something we're missing, something those drawings are trying to tell us." Emma spun around, incredulous. "Are you serious? Did you not see the last drawing, the one with our campsite? That wasn't a warning, it was a threat." "I know," Ryan said, "but if we just leave, we'll never understand what's happening. What if it doesn't stop? What if it follows us because we ignored it?" Claire crossed her arms. "And what exactly do you think you'll find? A magic answer? We don't even know what this is." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I'm not leaving until I try." Emma sighed, torn between fear and loyalty. "I can't let you go alone." Jake threw up his hands. "You've got to be kidding me. This is the dumbest—" "I'm staying here," Claire interrupted, her voice steady. And I suggest the rest of you do the same. We don't need to poke the bear." Ryan looked at Emma. "You coming?" She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay behind, but something in Ryan's expression made her nod. "Fine," Jake groaned. "You're all crazy. Go get yourselves killed. I'll be here when you come to your senses." With that, Ryan and Emma turned and began the trek back to the cave. Claire stayed behind with Jake, watching as their figures disappeared into the trees. "This is a mistake," Jake muttered. Claire didn't answer. She was staring into the woods, her face pale. "Jake, do you see that?" He followed her gaze and froze. In the shadows beyond the clearing, a tall, humanoid figure stood perfectly still, its hollow eyes gleaming. Ryan and Emma's footsteps echoed eerily as they re-entered the cave. The darkness inside felt heavier this time, like a living thing pressing down on them. Ryan's flashlight flickered, casting jittery beams of light across the walls. The drawings loomed larger than before, their jagged edges sharp and menacing. Emma's stomach churned as she scanned the walls. The humanoid figures were still there, but they had shifted again. This time the scene was almost unrecognizable. "Oh my God," she whispered. The drawings no longer depicted a group running from their campsite. Instead, they showed a figure standing alone in the forest, surrounded by twisted shadows. Another drawing depicted a second figure near the cave, its flashlight beam falling on one of the humanoid creatures. The crude images were unmistakable. The figures were Emma and Ryan. Ryan moved closer, his flashlight sweeping over the symbols and shapes. His hand trembled, and his voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "It's like it's keeping track of us, updating," Emma's voice cracked. "But how? How can something like this even happen?" Ryan didn't answer. His flashlight stopped on a new section of the wall, and Emma felt her heart drop. The drawing depicted the two of them standing exactly where they were now, their outlines illuminated by flashlight beams. Behind them, one of the elongated figures lurked in the shadows, its claws outstretched. "We need to leave," Emma said, panic rising in her chest. "Now." Ryan hesitated, his eyes glued to the drawing. "What if this is trying to tell us something? What if—" "Ryan," Emma snapped, grabbing his arm. "We're not waiting around to find out." The sound of shifting gravel made them both freeze. It echoed from deeper within the cave, low and steady, like something enormous moving slowly. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she tightened her grip on Ryan's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Ryan nodded, his eyes wide. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the source of the sound, the beam cutting through the inky darkness. It landed on an empty patch of cave wall. For a moment, there was nothing. And then a new drawing began to appear. Emma watched in horror as lines scratched themselves onto the stone, forming the jagged outline of a figure. The humanoid shape emerged slowly but deliberately, its long limbs and sharp claws coming into focus. It wasn't drawn with charcoal or pigment, but with something darker, something that seemed to seep from the stone itself. The figure was facing them. Emma stumbled backward, pulling Ryan with her. "We're leaving. Now." They turned and sprinted toward the cave entrance, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The air felt heavier with each step, the oppressive darkness clawing at their heels. Behind them, the sound of gravel shifting grew louder. Emma didn't dare look back. By the time Ryan and Emma returned to the campsite, they were both breathless and pale. Jake and Claire stood near the fire, their faces tense with worry. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the clearing. "What the hell happened?" Jake demanded, stepping forward. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "We need to leave," Emma blurted, her voice shaky. "Pack up everything right now." Ryan didn't argue, which immediately alarmed Claire. "What did you see?" she asked. "The drawings changed again," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're tracking us. It's like they know where we are." Claire frowned. "That's not possible. How could—" "It doesn't matter how," Emma snapped. "We just need to go. Now." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but then Claire pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "Look." Everyone turned. In the fading light just beyond the perimeter of their camp, shadows flickered unnaturally between the trees. They weren't moving with the wind or the light. They were deliberate, predatory. "What is that?" Jake whispered. No one answered. The group huddled closer together, the fire their only source of comfort against the encroaching darkness. The shadows stayed just out of reach, shifting and twisting, almost as if watching them. Ryan broke the silence. "We can't just stand here. Let's grab the gear and head back to the trailhead." "Agreed," Claire said quickly. "The sooner we're out of this forest, the better." The group scrambled to pack up their belongings, their movements frantic. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made them freeze, hearts pounding. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to grow bolder, creeping closer as the light faded completely. "Is anyone else hearing footsteps?" Jake whispered. Emma froze. "Don't say that." "I'm serious," he insisted, his voice barely audible. "It's coming from the woods, like someone's walking toward us." Ryan, trying to focus, tightened the straps on his pack. "Just move faster, don't think about it." They doused the fire, plunging the campsite into near darkness. Flashlights flicked on, their beams cutting through the night. The group moved in a tight formation, their steps hurried as they started down the trail. But the woods were different now. The trail that had been clear and well-marked earlier seemed to twist and branch unpredictably, leading them deeper into the forest instead of out. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches casting monstrous shapes in the light. "It wasn't like this before," Claire said, her voice trembling. "We should have hit the fork by now." Ryan stopped and turned, shining his flashlight back the way they came. The beam caught something, briefly. A flash of movement, a shadow shifting unnaturally fast between the trees. "They're following us," he whispered. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's following us?" Ryan didn't answer. He just started walking faster, his grip on the flashlight tightening. The group continued in silence, their breaths shallow and their ears straining for every sound. Behind them, faint footsteps echoed, matching their pace. They weren't alone. The group quickened their pace, their flashlights bouncing wildly as the trail twisted and turned. The sound of footsteps behind them was unmistakable now, soft, deliberate, and far too close. Every time one of them glanced over their shoulder, the shadows seemed to writhe as though something was just out of sight. "Stop," Claire hissed, her voice sharp. "Everyone stop." They froze, their breaths fogging in the cold night air. The forest was deathly silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves. Jake turned slowly, his flashlight shaking as he scanned the darkness. The beam caught something, a pair of glinting eyes, low to the ground and unmoving. "What is that?" Jake whispered. Before anyone could answer, the eyes blinked and vanished. A moment later, the sound of movement surrounded them, branches snapping, leaves crunching, coming from every direction. "They're circling us," Claire whispered, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. Emma's voice trembled. "What do we do?" Ryan took a shaky step forward, gesturing for the group to follow. "We keep moving. Don't stop. And don't look back." They pressed on, their footsteps hurried and uneven. The sounds in the forest grew louder, closer. A branch cracked to their left, followed by a low guttural sound that sent shivers down Emma's spine. She gripped her flashlight tighter, her knuckles white. "Ryan?" she whispered urgently. "Are we even on the trail anymore?" Ryan didn't answer. He was too focused on the path ahead, or what he thought was the path. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees growing denser and more twisted. The air felt heavier, pressing against their lungs with every breath. Jake suddenly stopped, grabbing Emma's arm. "Wait, look!" The group turned to see what he was pointing at. A tree ahead of them was marked with a crude carving, a symbol they recognized from the cave. It was one of the runes that had framed the drawings, etched deep into the bark. "That wasn't here before," Claire said, her voice barely audible. "It's marking the way," Ryan muttered, his face pale. "Like breadcrumbs." "Breadcrumbs for what?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "To lead us or to trap us?" The question hung in the air as another sound echoed through the forest, a long, inhuman wail that sent ice through their veins. It was followed by more movement, faster this time, rushing through the trees like a predator closing in on its prey. "They're getting closer," Emma said, panic flooding her voice. "We have to run." The group broke into a sprint, the trail disappearing beneath their feet as they plunged into the dark forest. The footsteps behind them grew louder, faster, and the shapes in the shadows seemed to close the distance with unnatural speed. Claire screamed as her flashlight flickered, momentarily plunging her into darkness. Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her forward as they ran. The forest seemed endless, the gnarled trees stretching on in every direction. And then they saw it. Ahead of them, a clearing opened up, bathed in faint moonlight. But it wasn't empty. In the center stood a figure, tall and distorted, its hollow eyes gleaming. The group skidded to a stop, frozen in place as the creature tilted its head, watching them. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, surrounding them completely. They were trapped. The creature in the clearing didn't move. It simply stood there, its elongated limbs hanging at unnatural angles. Its hollow eyes bore into them, and Emma felt as if it were looking straight into her soul. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. "Back up," Ryan whispered, his voice shaking. Slowly, the group took a collective step back, but the creature tilted its head further, a low clicking sound emanating from somewhere deep within its chest. It took a single, deliberate step forward. Jake panicked. "Screw this," he shouted, spinning around and running back into the forest. "Jake, no," Claire screamed, but he was already gone, the sound of his crashing footsteps quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. The creature's head snapped toward where Jake had fled, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then, without warning, it vanished, gone in an instant, as though it had dissolved into the shadows. "Run," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just run." The remaining three bolted in the opposite direction, their flashlights cutting frantic paths through the trees. Emma's lungs burned as she ran, her mind racing with the sound of Jake's footsteps fading into the distance. He was gone, and now they were too far from the trail, too far from safety. Ahead of them, the forest thinned slightly, revealing a familiar sight, the cave. Emma's heart sank as they skidded to a stop outside the yawning black entrance. "We can't go back in there," she said, her voice breaking. "You saw what it did. What if—" "We don't have a choice," Ryan interrupted, his eyes darting to the shadows behind them. "It's either the cave or whatever's out here." A guttural scream echoed through the forest, raw and piercing. Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't Jake. It wasn't human. "Move!" Ryan shouted, shoving Claire toward the entrance. The three of them stumbled into the cave, their flashlights illuminating the rough stone walls. The drawings greeted them once again, but now the figures seemed to writhe, as if trying to claw their way off the surface. "Seal the entrance," Ryan yelled, pushing a boulder toward the narrow opening. Claire and Emma joined him, using every ounce of their strength to block the entrance as much as they could. Outside, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps grew closer. The moment the boulder fell into place, the noise outside stopped. They stood there, breathing heavily, their flashlights flickering. The silence in the cave was deafening. Emma turned her beam toward the walls, and her stomach dropped. The drawings had changed again. Now they depicted three figures huddled in the cave, their outlines unmistakable. Surrounding them were the elongated creatures, their jagged limbs reaching in from all sides. One figure in the drawing had its head tilted toward the entrance, where a single hollow-eyed figure stood, watching. "That's us," Claire whispered, trembling. "It knows we're here." Ryan shone his flashlight deeper into the cave, his face pale. "There's something else." Emma turned her beam in the same direction and saw it, a new section of drawings. The crude figures showed the group's current situation, but the final image depicted them lying motionless on the ground, their flashlights extinguished. "It's not just tracking us," Emma said, her voice hollow. "It's predicting us." Something shifted in the darkness behind them. Emma spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam wavered, illuminating the uneven walls of the cave and the jagged drawings that seemed to pulse in the flickering light. For a moment, the darkness seemed to breathe, the air growing heavier with each passing second. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan stepped forward, his flashlight fixed on the deeper recesses of the cave. "Stay close. We need to find another way out." "There's no way out," Emma said, her voice cracking. "This is where it wants us." Ryan ignored her, taking another step into the suffocating blackness. The beam of his flashlight caught something ahead, movement, subtle and slow, as though the shadows themselves were alive. Emma's stomach churned as a faint scratching sound filled the air, echoing off the stone walls. Claire grabbed Emma's arm. "It's the drawings," she said, pointing to the nearest wall. Emma turned her light toward the drawings and froze. The figures were moving. Slowly, deliberately, the crude humanoid shape shifted, their limbs twisting and contorting as they crept closer to the figures representing Emma, Ryan, and Claire. The clawed hands of the creatures reached out, almost touching the human shapes. "Ryan," Emma whispered, her voice trembling, "we have to go." Before he could respond, the scratching grew louder, sharper, until it filled the entire cave. The sound was unbearable, like nails dragged across stone. Emma's flashlight flickered wildly, and she caught a glimpse of something in the darkness, a figure, impossibly tall, its hollow eyes glowing faintly as it stepped closer. "Run!" Ryan shouted, pulling Claire and Emma back toward the entrance. They stumbled over rocks, their flashlights barely holding back the darkness. The scratching noise followed them, growing louder and faster, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she reached the blocked entrance. "Move the boulder," Ryan yelled, shoving against the heavy rock. Claire and Emma joined him, straining against the weight. The sound of something scraping against the stone behind them grew deafening. Emma chanced a glance over her shoulder and saw it, the creature from the drawings, standing just a few feet away. Its elongated limbs twitched unnaturally, and its hollow eyes burned with malice. With a final desperate push, the boulder shifted just enough for them to slip through. They tumbled out into the cold night air, their flashlights swinging wildly as they sprinted into the forest. Behind them, the scratching noise faded, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the cave. The group didn't stop running until they reached the trailhead. Their bodies ached, their lungs burned, but they didn't dare look back. The forest was still, the trees eerily quiet as if nothing had happened. When they finally reached the parking lot, Emma collapsed onto the ground, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Ryan and Claire stood nearby, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. What was that?" Claire whispered, her voice breaking. Ryan didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the photos he had taken in the cave, his face twisted in horror as he stared at the final image. "What is it?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Ryan turned the screen toward them. The photo showed the three of them running out of the cave, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But in the background, barely visible, the creature stood at the cave's entrance, its hollow eyes fixed on the camera. Beneath it, new drawings had appeared on the walls, figures of Emma, Ryan, and Claire. This time, they weren't running. They were lying still, surrounded by the creatures, their flashlights extinguished. The group stared at the image in silence, the realization settling over them like a cold weight. "Oh, shit," Emma whispered. In the distance, from the direction of the cave, a faint scratching sound began again. "Hey Reddit, I'm not usually one to share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest. So a few days ago, something really weird happened to me, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Here's what went down. It all started with my car getting stolen. Yeah, I know, that's not exactly uncommon, but the way it happened was freaky. I parked my car in the usual spot right outside my apartment. It's a decent neighborhood, never had any issues before. The next morning, I step out and my car is just gone. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, nothing. It was like it just vanished into thin air. I called the police, obviously. They came, took my statement, and did their thing. But honestly, they didn't seem all that hopeful. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they were just going through the motions. It was like they'd seen this a million times, and my case was just another drop in the bucket. Days passed, and there was no news. I was getting more and more frustrated. The insurance process was a nightmare, and I needed my car for work. It felt like I was stuck in a loop of phone calls and paperwork, getting nowhere. One night, out of sheer boredom and frustration, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I surfed the dark web. I know, it sounds cliché and stupid, but I was desperate for a distraction. I'd messed around with it a bit in college, mostly out of curiosity, but this time I had a purpose. Maybe I thought I'd find some underground forum where stolen cars were a hot topic or something. I don't know. My mind was all over the place. First things first, I had to get Tor. For those who don't know, Tor is this browser that lets you access the dark web. It's like a browser within a browser, giving you access to sites that aren't indexed by search engines. It's supposed to keep you anonymous by bouncing your connection through a bunch of different servers. Next, I needed a VPN. If you're going to dive into the dark web, you don't want anyone tracking you. A VPN masks your IP address, making it look like you're browsing from a different location. I found a decent one, paid for it, and set it up. It felt like I was gearing up for some kind of secret mission. Once everything was ready, I launched Tor and started browsing. At first, it was just like I remembered, messy, chaotic, and a bit overwhelming. There were forums for everything you could think of, from conspiracy theories to hacking tutorials. Most of it was harmless enough, just people sharing their weird interests. But there were darker corners too, places where you could find stuff you really didn't want to see. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just wanted to take my mind off my missing car and the general crapstorm my life had become. I scrolled through page after page, not really absorbing anything. But then something caught my eye, a link to a site that promised exclusive automotive deals. I clicked on it, half expecting it to be some scam or joke. The site loaded slowly, like it was crawling out of the depths of the internet. When it finally did, it was surprisingly slick. There were pictures of cars, all kinds, from beat-up old clunkers to high-end sports cars. The prices were ridiculously low, like too good to be true low. I couldn't shake the feeling that these cars were probably stolen, but at that moment, I didn't care. A part of me was curious, another part was just numb. I kept scrolling, looking at the different makes and models, wondering who was behind this site and what their story was. That's when the idea hit me. What if I found my car here? It was a long shot, but stranger things have happened, right? I mean, my car had disappeared without a trace. Maybe, just maybe, it had ended up on some shady dark web marketplace. I decided to search for it, but that's a story for another part. For now, I'm just trying to process how a simple bout of boredom led me down this rabbit hole. And let me tell you, things only got weirder from here. Alright, so here's where things started to get really strange. After spending what felt like hours mindlessly scrolling through the dark web, I remembered why I was there in the first place. My car. The thought that I might actually find it on some illicit marketplace seemed absurd, but at the same time I couldn't shake it off. I went back to the automotive deals site. It was well organized, almost like a legitimate car dealership's website, which made it all the more unsettling. There were filters to search by make, model, year, and even color. It felt bizarrely professional for a place that was almost certainly selling stolen goods. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was nuts, but curiosity got the better of me. I typed in the details of my car, the make, model, year, and color. My heart was pounding as I hit enter. The page loaded, and there it was, a list of cars matching my search criteria. I scrolled through them, feeling a weird mix of anticipation and dread. The cars looked like they were in decent shape. Some even had detailed descriptions and photos. It was like browsing Craigslist, but with a sinister undertone. I kept scrolling, and then I saw it. My car. I knew it was mine because of the scratch on the left door. It was a long, jagged mark, something I'd gotten from a close call with a shopping cart a few months back. It was too specific to be a coincidence. I clicked on the listing, my hands shaking. There were more photos, and as I examined them, I became more and more certain. The little dent on the bumper, the worn-out seat covers, every detail matched. This was my car. A part of me felt vindicated. I wasn't crazy. My car had been stolen and ended up on this shady site. But now what? I wasn't planning to buy it back, that's for sure. The whole thing was surreal, like I was in a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I decided to look around the site a bit more, trying to figure out who was running it. There wasn't much to go on. No contact details, no names, just a generic contact form and a few cryptic messages about discrete transactions and satisfaction guaranteed. It was creepy. I was about to log off when I noticed something in the corner of the screen. A chat icon. It was blinking, indicating that someone was online and available to talk. I hesitated. This was getting deeper than I intended, but I had to know more. I clicked on the icon and a chat window popped up. The conversation started innocuously enough. I pretended to be a potential buyer, asking about a few different cars to not raise any suspicions. The person on the other end, who identified themselves only as agent, was quick to respond. They seemed professional, but there was a coldness to their replies that made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, I decided to go for it. I mentioned the car that looked like mine and asked if it was still available. Agent responded almost immediately, confirming that it was and offering more details. I couldn't help myself. I typed, "That's my car. It was stolen a few days ago. I want it back." There was a long pause. For a moment I thought they might have logged off. But then a new message appeared. "We don't deal in stolen goods. You must be mistaken." I felt a surge of anger. "Don't lie to me. I know it's my car. I'll go to the police." Another long pause, then the reply, "This will cost you a lot and we don't mean money." My blood ran cold. What did that mean? I sat there staring at the screen, my mind racing. This had gone from weird to downright terrifying. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to shut everything down and forget this ever happened. But another part, the stubborn part, wanted answers. I logged off the dark web, my heart still pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line, and there was no going back. I had to think about my next move carefully. But for now, all I could do was try to get some sleep and hope that things wouldn't get any worse. After a night of restless sleep, I woke up with a sense of dread hanging over me. The conversation from the dark web played on a loop in my mind. "This will cost you a lot, and we don't mean money." What did that even mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had poked a hornet's nest. Despite my fears, curiosity, and a sense of justice drove me back to my computer. I needed to know more about this site and the people behind it. I logged back onto the dark web, carefully following the same steps, launching Tor, connecting the VPN, and navigating to the shady car marketplace. This time I was more methodical. I examined the listing for my car again, paying close attention to every detail. The photos showed the interior and exterior from various angles. Each image only solidified my certainty. This was my car. The scratch on the left door, the specific wear and tear, even a little sticker on the rear windshield that I had put there myself. I decided to dive deeper into the website's inner workings. There had to be some kind of trail, something that could lead me to the perpetrators. I started by looking at the metadata of the images. It was a long shot, but sometimes photos carry information about where and when they were taken. Most of the data was stripped, but I found one image that still had some metadata intact. It was a GPS coordinate. My heart skipped a beat. It pointed to a location on the outskirts of the city, in an industrial area that I wasn't familiar with. This was the lead I needed. I spent the rest of the day planning my next steps. Going to the police again seemed futile. They hadn't been much help before, and I didn't have enough concrete evidence. Instead, I decided to do some reconnaissance myself. It was risky, but I couldn't let this go. That evening, I drove out to the location. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the abandoned warehouses and empty lots. The place had an eerie, desolate feel to it, the kind that makes you constantly look over your shoulder. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows. As I approached the coordinates, I saw a fenced-off area with a few cars parked inside. I couldn't see much from my vantage point, but there was a small building with lights on. This had to be it. I needed a closer look, but breaking in was out of the question. I wasn't equipped for that, and who knew what kind of security they had. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos from a distance. It wasn't much, but it was something. I decided to retreat for now and think about my next move. As I turned to leave, I noticed a camera mounted on one of the buildings, pointing directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Had they seen me? I didn't wait to find out. I hurried back to my car and drove home, trying to stay calm. Back at my apartment, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. They weren't great, but they showed enough to confirm that this was some kind of chop shop or illegal dealership. I needed more evidence and a plan to get my car back without getting myself killed. I decided to contact the site again, this time with a more direct approach. I logged back onto the dark web and opened the chat with Agent. My fingers trembled as I typed, "I have proof that you have my car. I know where you are. Give it back, or I'll go to the police with everything I've found." The response was almost immediate. "You're making a mistake. This will cost you." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "I don't care. I want my car back." There was a long pause. Then a new message appeared. "We can arrange a meeting. Tomorrow night, midnight. Come alone. You'll get your car." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. This could be a trap, but what choice did I have? I needed to see this through. I agreed to the meeting, noting the location they provided. It was the same industrial area I had visited earlier. As I logged off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something much bigger than just a stolen car. I spent the rest of the night preparing, making sure I had everything I might need. Tomorrow I'd confront them and hopefully get my car back. But deep down, I knew things were about to get a lot more dangerous. The next day was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I tried to go about my usual routine, but my mind was consumed with what lay ahead. Midnight felt like a lifetime away, yet it also approached far too quickly. By the time the clock struck 11, I was ready to go, every nerve in my body on edge. I drove out to the industrial area again, parking my car a safe distance away. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every little sound. I made my way to the agreed meeting spot, a clearing between two large warehouses. The only light came from a single flickering street lamp, casting long, unsettling shadows. I stood there, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes felt like hours. Just when I started to think I'd been stood up, I heard the sound of footsteps. 3 men emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them was holding a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom and making me squint. "You must be the one causing all the trouble," the man with the flashlight said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong." "I just want my car back," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's all." The man chuckled. "It's not that simple. You've seen things you shouldn't have. You've made threats. This isn't going to end well for you." I felt a rush of fear, but I stood my ground. "I have proof. If anything happens to me, it'll go to the police. Just give me my car and I'll disappear. You'll never hear from me again." The men exchanged glances. The tension was palpable. Finally, the man with the flashlight spoke again. "Fine, follow us." They led me through a narrow alley between the warehouses. My senses were on high alert, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I needed to see this through. We reached a small, dimly lit garage. Inside, there it was, my car. The sight of it filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. "There's your car," the man said, "but we can't just let you walk away. You've caused us too much trouble." Before I could react, I felt a sharp pain in my side. One of the men had struck me with something hard. I doubled over, gasping for breath. They grabbed me, holding me down. "This will cost you a lot, and we don't mean money," the man with the flashlight said, his voice cold. I struggled, panic surging through me. "Please, just let me go. I won't say anything, I swear." But they weren't listening. The next few minutes were a blur of pain and fear. They beat me, making sure I understood the consequences of crossing them. When they finally let me go, I was bruised and bleeding, barely able to stand. "Take your car and leave," the man said. "But remember, we're watching you. Any more trouble, and it'll be much worse next time." I stumbled to my car, my vision blurry. Somehow I managed to start the engine and drive away. The journey home was a haze of pain and confusion. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to follow me, but they didn't. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I collapsed on the couch, my body aching. I knew I should go to the police, but fear held me back. They had warned me, and I believed them. I was in way over my head. Now, I'm sitting here, typing this out, hoping someone on Reddit can give me some advice. What should I do? I got my car back, but at what cost? I'm scared, and I don't know who to trust. If anyone has any ideas, please let me know. I'm in a really bad situation, and I don't know how to get out of it. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I was a mess, physically battered and mentally exhausted. I could barely sleep, constantly haunted by the memory of that night and the chilling threats of those men. I didn't feel safe in my own home, jumping at every creak and shadow. I tried to lay low, sticking to a strict routine and avoiding any places where I might be recognized. But paranoia has a way of creeping in, and soon I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. There were always the same cars parked near my apartment, the same people loitering nearby. Were they watching me? Or was it just my imagination? One evening, about a week after the encounter, I decided to test my theory. I took an unfamiliar route home from work, weaving through back streets and making random turns. Sure enough, a black SUV was tailing me. I panicked, driving faster and taking even more erratic turns until I lost them. My heart was pounding, and I knew I couldn't keep living like this. That night, I finally went to the police. I told them everything about my stolen car, the dark web marketplace, the threatening messages, and the brutal beating. They listened, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Still, they took my statement and promised to look into it. But I could tell they didn't fully believe me. It was just too bizarre. I left the police station feeling more alone than ever. If the authorities couldn't help me, who could? I turned to the only place I hadn't yet, Reddit. I posted my story, laying out every detail, hoping someone, anyone, could offer advice or at least some kind of support. The response was overwhelming. My post blew up, with hundreds of comments pouring in. Some people offered practical advice: change all my passwords, install security cameras, get a new phone. Others shared their own horror stories, making me feel less alone. But the most common advice was to get out of town, at least for a while. One user, who seemed particularly knowledgeable about the dark web, messaged me privately. They told me I was dealing with dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to harm me again. They urged me to leave immediately and even offered to help me find a safe place to stay. I didn't know if I could trust them, but I was desperate. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between me and my city as possible. Eventually, I checked into a small motel in a town where no one knew me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I kept a low profile, only going out when necessary and always looking over my shoulder. I stayed in touch with the helpful Redditor, who continued to give me advice on how to stay safe and avoid being tracked. As the days turned into weeks, the fear began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could put this nightmare behind me, but I knew I could never truly let my guard down. The memory of those men and their threats would stay with me forever. Now I'm rebuilding my life slowly but surely. I've learned to be more careful, more aware of my surroundings. I've also learned that sometimes the internet's darkest corners can reach out and touch you in ways you never imagined. I'm still on Reddit, but now I'm the one offering advice to others who find themselves in over their heads. If my story can help someone else avoid the same fate, then maybe some good can come from all of this. To anyone reading this, be careful out there. You never know what you might find when you go looking in the dark. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are good people out there, even in the darkest of places. Stay safe and stay vigilant. Hey Reddit. So I'm a 26-year-old guy, and I've always been into computers. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by technology. While other kids were out playing sports, I was the one tinkering with our old desktop, figuring out how to upgrade RAM, or rooting through forums to solve some obscure software glitch. Naturally, I became pretty good at it. I even ended up with a job in IT, which I love, but it can get a bit monotonous at times. Besides work, I'm an avid gamer. I love immersing myself in virtual worlds where I can escape reality and be anyone I want. The thrill of the game, the strategy, the graphics, it's all a rush. But, let's be honest, even gaming can become repetitive after a while. One evening I found myself bored out of my mind. I had played through my entire library of games, binge-watched every series worth watching, and read through my favorite forums twice over. That's when I remembered a conversation I had with a friend a while back about the dark web. He mentioned how it's this hidden part of the internet where you can find all sorts of bizarre stuff, far beyond what you'd see on the regular web. That got me curious. I wanted to see for myself what all the hype was about. Downloading Tor was a breeze for someone like me. For those who don't know, Tor is a browser that lets you access the dark web by anonymizing your internet traffic. It was exciting, almost like a forbidden adventure. I felt a mix of nervousness and exhilaration as I set it up. The dark web has this aura of mystery around it, and I was about to dive in head first. The first time I opened Tor and started browsing, it felt like stepping into a completely different universe. Websites didn't look like your typical clean, polished pages. They were raw, filled with cryptic links, strange symbols, and eerie aesthetics. I saw marketplaces selling everything from drugs to fake IDs, forums discussing conspiracy theories, and even hitmen for hire. It was both fascinating and terrifying. Despite the initial shock, my curiosity kept me going. I delved deeper, exploring hidden corners and obscure forums. The anonymity of it all was both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed people to share things they wouldn't normally share on the surface web, it also meant you had no idea who you were dealing with. One night, after hours of browsing, I stumbled upon something that piqued my interest: a forum dedicated to alternative news. At first, it seemed like just another conspiracy theory hub. But as I read through the posts, I realized there was something more sinister at play. The posts were filled with outrageous claims, bizarre theories, and exclusive information. They were presented in a way that made them seem credible, but my gut told me something was off. As I continued to read, I noticed that these posts were all linked to a single user. This guy had a significant following, and people were buying into his stories. But something felt wrong. His claims were too outrageous, too well-timed, and all seemed to lead back to him promoting various products and services. It was like he was using fear and misinformation to sell stuff. That's when it hit me. I had stumbled upon a scammer using fake news to manipulate people on the dark web. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that this guy was a fraud. But exposing him would be risky. I had heard enough stories about people getting in over their heads on the dark web, and I didn't want to become one of them. Still, the idea of letting this guy get away with scamming innocent people didn't sit right with me. I decided I had to do something, but I had no idea what I was getting myself into. So there I was, knee-deep in the underbelly of the internet, staring at post after post of what I knew were blatant lies. This guy, let's call him Dark Merchant, had crafted an elaborate web of deceit. His posts ranged from fake medical cures to supposed government cover-ups, but the common thread was that each post ended with a link to some product he was selling. Miracle supplements, survival gear, you name it. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just some basement dweller playing tricks on people. The production value of his posts was too high, the language too persuasive, and the timing too precise. He had to be making a significant amount of money from this, and that meant people were getting hurt. I spent hours combing through his posts, saving screenshots and tracing links. My IT background came in handy here. I was able to use various tools to dig deeper into the metadata of his posts and the websites he linked to. Slowly, I started to piece together a picture of his operation. It wasn't just one guy with a computer. It was an entire network of sites and forums, all interconnected and designed to funnel traffic towards his scams. What really disturbed me was the number of people falling for it. There were testimonials, comments from people who had spent their hard-earned money on his fake cures and products. Some of these people were desperate, looking for a miracle solution to their problems. They trusted Dark Merchant, and he exploited that trust. I felt a knot in my stomach as I read through story after story. This wasn't just some harmless internet prank. This was predatory behavior, and it was ruining lives. I knew I had to act, but I needed solid proof to expose him. For the next few weeks, I gathered evidence. I created a detailed dossier complete with screenshots, links, and my analysis of how his network operated. But I needed more. I needed undeniable proof that he was behind these scams. So I decided to bait him. Using an alias, I reached out to him, pretending to be a gullible mark interested in one of his products. I engaged him in conversation, asking questions and feigning interest. As expected, he responded promptly, guiding me through the process of purchasing his latest miracle cure. I recorded our entire interaction, capturing his tactics and the way he manipulated me into buying his product. The more I interacted with him, the more I realized how dangerous he was. He was smooth, persuasive, and had an answer for every doubt I raised. But in his eagerness to secure a sale, he slipped up. He mentioned a detail about shipping that allowed me to trace one of his drop points. It was a small crack, but it was enough. With this new information, I was able to find a physical address linked to one of his operations. I knew I couldn't confront him directly. That would be suicide. Instead, I decided to expose him the best way I knew how, by turning his own tactics against him. I created a series of bots designed to flood his forums and websites with the evidence I had gathered. These bots would post the screenshots, the chat logs, and the analysis of his network. They would make it impossible for anyone to visit his sites without seeing the truth. It took me days to get everything ready, but I was determined. Finally, I unleashed the bots. Within hours, his forums were flooded with posts exposing his scams. The responses were immediate and explosive. People were outraged, demanding answers and sharing their own experiences of being duped. It was chaos, but it was also justice, but my victory was short-lived. As I would soon learn, you can't take down a predator without consequences. I thought I had won. I sat back, watching as my bots did their job, flooding Dark Merchant's forums with irrefutable evidence of his scams. The outpouring of anger and betrayal from his followers was intense. People were finally seeing the truth, and it felt good to be the catalyst for that. However, my sense of victory was fleeting. It didn't take long for Dark Merchant to notice what was happening. The man was clearly no amateur. He responded swiftly and ruthlessly. Within hours, he managed to shut down several of his compromised forums and websites, moving his operations to new domains. But the damage was done. His reputation was tarnished, and his followers were in uproar. Then the messages started. At first, they were just emails. Anonymous threats telling me to stop what I was doing, warning me that I didn't know who I was dealing with. They were unsettling, but I shrugged them off as empty bluster. I was, after all, just a faceless user on the internet. How could he possibly find me? But Dark Merchant was more resourceful than I had given him credit for. One morning I woke up to find my personal email flooded with messages. My social media accounts were compromised, and my phone was blowing up with threatening texts and calls. Somehow he had tracked me down. My heart raced as I read the latest message. "You think you're smart? You think you can expose me without consequences? You have no idea what you've started. I've paid good money to make sure you regret this. Enjoy the time you have left." Panic set in. This was no longer just an online battle. This was real, and it was personal. I couldn't believe I had been so naive to think I could get away unscathed. I immediately took steps to secure my accounts and change all my passwords, but the sense of dread remained. For the next few days, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. Then, one night, as I was walking home from a late shift at work, I noticed two men in black suits trailing me. They were keeping their distance, but their presence was unmistakable. My mind raced back to Dark Merchant's threats. He had paid people to finish me. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I bolted, sprinting down side streets and alleyways, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear their footsteps behind me, relentless and determined. Adrenaline fueled my flight, and I eventually managed to lose them, ducking into a crowded bar and blending in with the patrons. Shaken and terrified, I knew I couldn't stay. I went home, packed a bag with essentials, and booked the first flight out of the country. I didn't have a plan, just an urgent need to disappear. Leaving everything behind, my job, my friends, my family, was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. But I couldn't risk my life. I ended up in a small town halfway across the world, trying to start over. But the paranoia followed me. Every unfamiliar face, every unrecognized car felt like a potential threat. I couldn't shake the fear that Dark Merchant's reach extended even here. My life was shattered. I had thought I was doing the right thing, exposing a scammer and protecting innocent people, but in the end I was the one who paid the price. I had underestimated the darkness of the web I had entangled myself in. In my new nondescript life, I tried to blend in and stay off the radar. I had chosen a small, quiet town far removed from the chaos I left behind. I found a modest apartment, got a low-profile job in a local tech repair shop, and did my best to keep my head down. But the fear never left me. I was always looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of those two men in black suits. Months went by, and I started to think maybe I had successfully escaped. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "We haven't forgotten. We never forget." My heart sank. They had found me again. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every time my phone rang or I got a message, I expected it to be another threat. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, isolated, and helpless. Then, one night, it escalated. I was walking home from work, taking my usual route through a quiet, dimly lit park. I felt a chill run down my spine as I noticed two figures in the shadows, dressed in black suits. They were watching me just like before. Panic set in and I started to walk faster, but they matched my pace. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear their footsteps behind me getting closer. I darted through the park, trying to lose them in the maze of paths and trees, but they were relentless. I managed to make it to a main road, breathless and terrified, and hailed a passing taxi. I barely managed to explain my destination to the driver, but he seemed to understand my urgency and sped off. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the two men standing at the edge of the park, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. That was the final straw. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I contacted an old friend who lived in another country and explained my situation. They were sympathetic and offered to help me get settled in a new place. It was my only option. I packed my things, said goodbye to the life I had tried to build, and fled once again. This time I moved to a remote village in a country where I knew nobody would think to look for me. I changed my name, my appearance, and did everything I could to erase my digital footprint. Life in the village was simple and quiet, but the damage was done. I was a shell of my former self, constantly haunted by the fear that they would find me again. The dark web had cast a long shadow over my life, and there was no escaping it. I had learned the hard way that messing with dangerous people online comes with real-world consequences. I had thought I was being a hero, exposing a scammer and protecting innocent people, but in reality, I had underestimated the lengths to which these people would go to protect their operations. The dark web is a place of shadows and secrets, and I had poked my head too far into the darkness. My life would never be the same, and I would always carry the scars of my encounter with Dark Merchant and his network. Life in the remote village was a far cry from my previous existence. I had exchanged the hum of city life for the tranquility of the countryside, hoping to find peace and safety. But no matter how far I ran, the fear always followed me. I couldn't escape the memories or the constant paranoia that they would find me again. I took up odd jobs, working under the radar to avoid drawing attention. The villagers were kind, but I kept to myself, afraid that getting too close to anyone might put them in danger. My life had become a shadow of what it once was, consumed by the consequences of my actions. One evening, as I was sitting in my small rented room, I received an email. It was from another anonymous source, but this one was different. Instead of threats, it contained a single message. "We know where you are, but we're watching someone else now." The relief was immediate but short-lived. While it seemed that Dark Merchant's focus had shifted away from me, the knowledge that they were still out there, watching, was unnerving. I had been fortunate enough to escape their grasp, but I knew they wouldn't hesitate to ruin someone else's life if it suited their needs. The experience had left me broken, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. The dark web was a dangerous place, filled with people who would go to any lengths to protect their interests. I had learned this the hard way, and it had cost me everything: my home, my friends, my sense of security. I decided to share my story on Reddit, hoping it might serve as a cautionary tale for others who might be tempted to venture into the dark web. Maybe, just maybe, it would deter someone from making the same mistakes I did. So Reddit, here I am, a ghost of my former self, hiding in a remote village halfway around the world. I've shared my story in the hopes that it might help someone else. Now, I have a few questions for you. Was it real? Do you think this could have all been in my head, or was I truly in danger? Was it fake? Could this have been an elaborate hoax, or is the dark web really that dangerous? Am I overreacting? Did I make the right decision by running, or was there another way I could have handled it? What would you have done? If you were in my place, how would you have dealt with the situation? Is there any way to regain my old life? Can I ever feel safe and normal again? Or is this my new reality? I'd appreciate any advice or thoughts. This experience has left me feeling lost and isolated, and I'm hoping that sharing it with this community can provide some much-needed perspective. Thanks for listening. To anyone reading this, please be careful. The internet is a vast and dangerous place, and sometimes curiosity can lead you down paths better left unexplored. I've always been a curious person. Too curious, some might say. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were a rare commodity. My insatiable thirst for the unknown often led me down rabbit holes that most people would avoid. And it was this curiosity that eventually led me to the dark web. I had heard about the dark web in passing, mostly in horror stories or cautionary tales shared online. It was supposed to be a place of unspeakable horrors and illegal activities, a hidden part of the internet where the law couldn't reach. But to me, it was just another mystery waiting to be explored. One night, after a few too many beers and a lot of boredom, I decided to take the plunge. I downloaded Tor, the browser everyone said you needed to access the dark web, and started my journey. At first it was underwhelming. Most of the sites I found were either scams or completely innocuous. I was about to give up when I stumbled upon a forum discussing mystery boxes. The concept was simple. You paid a certain amount of money, and in return, you received a box filled with random items. Some people got lucky and received valuable electronics or rare collectibles. Others got junk. But the thrill was in the unknown, the gamble of it all. And as someone who loved a good mystery, I was hooked. I found a vendor with decent reviews and placed an order. It wasn't cheap, but I figured it was worth it for the experience. I paid in Bitcoin, as was required, and waited. The vendor promised delivery within 2 weeks, and during that time, I couldn't help but let my imagination run wild. What would be in the box? Would it be something amazing or something completely useless? 2 weeks came and went, but no box arrived. I reached out to the vendor, but my messages went unanswered. Frustrated, I posted on the forum asking if anyone else had experienced delays. That's when things started to get weird. I received a private message almost immediately after my post. It was from an anonymous user with a string of random numbers and letters for a username. The message read, "Stop looking for the box. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." I laughed it off at first. It had to be a prank, right? But the next day I received another message, this time with a photo attached. It was a picture of my house, taken from the street. The message simply said, "We're watching." Panic set in. How did they know where I lived? I locked all the doors and windows, convinced myself it was just a coincidence. But the messages kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. They knew things about me, personal things that no one else could possibly know. By this point, I was in full-blown paranoia mode. I stopped going out, barely slept, and constantly checked my surroundings for any sign of surveillance. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That I had ordered a mystery box from the dark web and was now being stalked by some anonymous psycho? They'd probably laugh me out of the station. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was another message, but this one was different. It was a video. With trembling hands, I opened it. The video showed a figure dressed in all black standing outside my house. They looked directly into the camera and said, "You should have listened. Now it's too late." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no longer a game or a prank. This was real, and I was in serious danger. I didn't know what to do, where to turn. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, and fast. But as I packed a bag and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The darkness had found me, and there was no escaping it. My mind raced as I stuffed clothes and essentials into a backpack. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt like a harbinger of doom. I had to leave. But where would I go? My parents' house was too far, and my friends wouldn't understand, let alone be equipped to help. I decided to check into a motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the best place, but it was anonymous enough to buy me some time. I grabbed my keys and slipped out the back door, avoiding the streetlights, sticking to the shadows. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Driving through deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every car that passed made me jump. Every pedestrian seemed to stare a little too long. Paranoia clung to me like a second skin. I finally reached the motel, a dingy, run-down place that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. Perfect. The clerk didn't ask questions, which was a small mercy. I paid in cash and took the key to a room at the far end of the building. Once inside, I locked and bolted the door, shoved a chair under the handle for good measure, and checked the windows to ensure they were secure. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. My phone buzzed again. Dreading what I might see, I hesitated before opening the message. It was another video, this time showing the inside of my house. The figure in black walked through my living room, pausing to examine family photos on the mantel. They picked one up and held it to the camera. It was a picture of me and my parents. Then they smashed it on the floor. The message that followed was chilling. You can run, but you can't hide. Fear turned into cold resolve. This had gone too far. I had to figure out who was behind this and why they were targeting me. I opened my laptop, connected to the motel's sketchy Wi-Fi, and returned to the dark web forum where I had initially found the mystery box vendor. My post about the delay was still there, and so were the replies, now filled with people warning me to stop digging. I messaged a few of the more helpful-sounding users, explaining my situation and asking for advice. Most of them told me the same thing: cut all ties with the dark web, change all my passwords, and go to the police. One user, however, stood out. They claimed to have been in a similar situation and offered to help me track down the person behind the threats. Desperate, I agreed. They guided me through the process of tracing Bitcoin transactions, using software to decrypt messages, and digging deeper into the dark web than I had ever gone before. It was dangerous territory, but I had no choice. Hours turned into days as I holed up in that grimy motel room, surviving on vending machine snacks and coffee. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep this went. The mystery box vendor was part of a larger network, a web of criminals and hackers who thrived on exploiting people's curiosity and fear. The person targeting me wasn't just a random psycho. They were part of something much bigger and much more dangerous. I finally managed to trace the transactions to a location in my own town, a rundown warehouse in an industrial area. It was a risky move, but I had to go there. I had to confront them and put an end to this nightmare. Armed with nothing but my phone and a deep-seated sense of determination, I set out. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. I parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, my heart pounding in my ears. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, and every shadow seemed to move. I crept through the corridors, following the faint hum of machinery. I turned a corner and froze. There in the center of the room was a setup of computers and servers, cables snaking across the floor like vines, and in front of them stood the figure in black. They turned to face me, removing their mask. It was a man, mid-30s, with cold, calculating eyes. "You should have listened," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now you've seen too much." I had to act fast. I lunged at him, knocking over equipment and causing a shower of sparks. We struggled, grappling in the dim light until I managed to get the upper hand. I grabbed a heavy piece of metal and swung it, knocking him out cold. Breathing heavily, I took a moment to collect myself. I had done it. But as I looked around the room, I realized this was far from over. The network he was part of was still out there, and they wouldn't take kindly to my interference. I had a long road ahead, but for the first time I felt a glimmer of hope. The warehouse was eerily silent after the struggle. The man lay unconscious at my feet, and the humming of the servers was the only sound that broke the stillness. I knew I didn't have much time. Grabbing a few flash drives from the nearest computer, I quickly downloaded whatever data I could, hoping it might help me understand who these people were and how to stop them. As I left the warehouse, the weight of what had just happened settled on me. I had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. I returned to my motel room, heart pounding, and immediately started going through the data I had retrieved. It was a treasure trove of information: emails, transaction records, and chat logs. but decoding it would take time, and I didn't know how long I had before they came after me again. I contacted the user who had helped me track the transactions, sending them a portion of the data. They responded quickly, promising to help analyze it and identify the key players involved. While they worked on their end, I decided to take a different approach. It was time to involve the authorities. Walking into the police station, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I asked to speak with a detective, insisting it was urgent. When I finally sat down with one, I laid everything out. My dark web adventure, the mystery box, the threats, and the warehouse. The detective listened, skeptical at first, but as I showed him the videos and messages, his expression changed. "This is serious," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll need to investigate, but I need you to stay somewhere safe. Can you do that?" I nodded, relieved that someone was finally taking me seriously. They arranged for me to stay in a safe house while they conducted their investigation. It was a small, nondescript apartment on the edge of town, but it felt like a fortress compared to the motel. Days turned into a week as I waited for updates. The user from the dark web forum, who I now knew as Raven, continued to feed me information. They had managed to identify several key figures in the network, all of whom were scattered across the globe. But the man I had confronted was a significant player, and his capture had undoubtedly sent shockwaves through their organization. One evening, as I was going through the latest batch of decoded data, I received a call from the detective. "We've made some progress," he said. "We raided the warehouse and found more evidence. It looks like you were right. This is a big operation, but we need your help to take them down. Can you come in tomorrow?" The next day I met with the detective and his team. They had mapped out the entire network, identifying key locations and individuals. They were planning coordinated raids and needed my insight to ensure nothing was overlooked. It felt surreal, sitting in a police station, planning a takedown of a criminal organization that I had inadvertently stumbled upon. The raids were scheduled for dawn. I waited anxiously in the safe house, glued to my phone as updates trickled in. The operation was a success. They had arrested several high-ranking members and seized a trove of evidence. But the victory was bittersweet. The network was vast, and while we had dealt a significant blow, it was far from destroyed. In the days that followed, I slowly began to piece my life back together. The threats ceased, and the detective assured me that they were keeping a close eye on the remaining suspects. Raven continued to assist the authorities, and we maintained contact, bonded by our strange and terrifying experience. One evening, as I sat on the porch of the safe house, enjoying the first sense of peace I had felt in weeks, my phone buzzed with a message from Raven. "You did good," it read. "Stay safe, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of closure. The nightmare was over, but the experience had changed me. I had ventured into the darkest corners of the internet and faced dangers I never could have imagined. But I had come out the other side, stronger and more aware of the shadows that lurk in the digital world. As I prepared to move back to my own home, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of vigilance. The dark web was still out there, a hidden realm of secrets and dangers. But now, I knew how to navigate it. And I knew that sometimes curiosity could lead to places best left unexplored. Returning to my home seemed like a distant dream as I packed my belongings from the safe house. The police had assured me that my house was secure, but a part of me still felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the nightmare was far from over. The drive back started uneventfully. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the road, and I tried to focus on the mundane details of the journey to calm my nerves. Every so often, I would glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something suspicious. But the road behind me was clear, and I began to relax, convincing myself that the worst was behind me. About halfway home, as I was driving through a less populated stretch of highway, a black SUV appeared behind me. It was nothing unusual at first, just another vehicle on the road. But after a few miles, I noticed it was still there, maintaining a steady distance. I changed lanes to see if it would pass, but it mirrored my movements. My heart rate quickened. I accelerated, hoping to lose the SUV, but it sped up as well. Panic set in as I realized this wasn't a coincidence. I was being followed. I remembered the detective's words, "Stay somewhere safe." I should have known better than to let my guard down. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, my car roaring down the highway. The SUV followed suit, closing the gap. I had to think fast. The area was remote, with no nearby exits or places to hide. I spotted a dirt road branching off the highway and took a sharp turn onto it, the tires skidding as I fought to maintain control. The SUV followed, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. The dirt road was rough, filled with potholes and rocks that jolted my car violently. My heart pounded in my chest as I swerved to avoid obstacles, praying that I could outrun them. The road twisted and turned through dense woods, and I could feel the SUV gaining on me. In a desperate move, I spotted a narrow path barely wide enough for my car. I veered onto it, branches scraping against the sides as I plunged deeper into the forest. The SUV hesitated for a moment before following, its bulk making it harder to navigate the tight turns. The path opened into a small clearing. I saw an old abandoned cabin and a barn. Without thinking, I drove behind the barn, cutting the engine and holding my breath. The SUV roared into the clearing, its driver scanning the area. I could see them through a crack in the barn wall, a burly man with a grim expression. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, hoping they wouldn't find me. The SUV circled the clearing once more before speeding off, presumably thinking I had continued on the path. I waited until the sound of the engine faded into the distance before daring to move. I knew I couldn't stay there. They would likely return, and I was too exposed. I made my way through the woods on foot, keeping off the main roads. I needed a plan, somewhere to go where they wouldn't find me. My phone was still in my car, and I cursed myself for leaving it behind. After what felt like hours of trudging through the forest, I reached a small town. Exhausted and dirty, I walked into a diner, drawing concerned looks from the patrons. I borrowed the phone from the waitress and called the detective, explaining everything in a hushed, frantic voice. "Stay put," he instructed. "We'll send someone to get you. Don't go anywhere." I sat in the corner of the diner, nerves frayed, watching the door every time it opened. True to their word, an unmarked police car arrived shortly, and I was ushered into the back seat by a plainclothes officer. They took me to another safe location, a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The detective met me there, his face grim. "They're more persistent than we thought," he said. "We've underestimated their reach. We'll need to take extra precautions." I nodded, too tired and shaken to argue. The reality of my situation was hitting me hard. I wasn't just dealing with random threats anymore. This was an organized, relentless pursuit. And until we could dismantle the entire network, I wouldn't be safe. I spent the next few days in a heightened state of alert. The police increased their efforts, conducting more raids and interrogating the captured members. Raven continued to provide invaluable information, helping to piece together the puzzle of this dark web syndicate. But even as progress was made, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The shadow of the dark web loomed large, and I knew that until every last thread was unraveled, I couldn't afford to let my guard down. The days in the safe house were a blur of anxiety and restless anticipation. The detective and his team were doing everything they could, but I couldn't ignore the constant gnawing fear that someone might find me again. The dark web syndicate was proving to be more resilient and resourceful than we had anticipated. One evening, as I was going through the latest updates from Raven, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding. "Hello? Stay calm. We've found their base of operations." Raven's voice was tense but steady. "It's not far from where you are. We need to act fast, and we need your help." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you need me to do?" Raven outlined a plan that involved me acting as bait to draw the remaining members out while the police raided their hideout. It was dangerous, but it seemed like the only way to end this once and for all. I agreed, knowing that this was the only way to reclaim my life. The next morning, I met with the detective and Raven in a secluded location. We went over the plan multiple times, ensuring every detail was covered. I would drive to a predetermined location and wait while the police and Raven's team prepared to storm the hideout. As I drove to the rendezvous point, every nerve in my body was on edge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the deserted road. I parked and waited, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, and I recognized the black SUV. My heart raced as it approached, stopping a few feet from my car. A man stepped out, the same one I had encountered at the warehouse. He walked towards me, a sinister smile on his face. "Thought you could hide from us?" he sneered. "You've caused us a lot of trouble." I held my ground, trying to appear calm. "It ends here," I said, hoping the police were in position. He laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "Oh, I don't think so." Before I could react, 2 more men emerged from the SUV, weapons drawn. My mind raced as I realized the plan had gone awry. But just as they closed in, a series of blinding lights and deafening sirens erupted around us. The police had arrived. "Drop your weapons, hands in the air." The detective's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. The men hesitated for a split second before chaos erupted. Shots were fired, and I ducked behind my car, heart pounding. The police swarmed the area, engaging the syndicate members in a tense standoff. Raven and his team moved with precision, quickly gaining the upper hand. In the midst of the chaos, the man who had confronted me tried to escape. I saw him make a dash for the woods, and without thinking, I followed. I couldn't let him get away. I chased him through the dense underbrush, branches whipping at my face until I tackled him to the ground. We struggled, but adrenaline gave me the strength to hold him down until the police arrived. They pulled him off me, slapping handcuffs on his wrists. I stood there, panting, as the reality of the situation sank in. It was over. Back at the police station, the mood was one of relief and celebration. The raids had been successful, and the key members of the syndicate were in custody. The dark web network had been dismantled, and the threat was finally neutralized. The detective approached me, a look of respect in his eyes. "You did good, kid. This wouldn't have been possible without you." I nodded, too exhausted to respond. All I wanted was to go home and forget this nightmare. Raven approached, offering a rare smile. "You're free now. But remember, the dark web is always out there. Stay safe." In the following days, I finally returned home. It felt surreal, walking through my front door, knowing the danger had passed. I took my time settling back in, appreciating the mundane normalcy of life. The experience had changed me, made me more cautious, but it had also made me stronger. I never returned to the dark web, and I never ordered another mystery box. The thrill of the unknown had lost its appeal, replaced by a deep appreciation for the safety and simplicity of everyday life. The shadows of the past lingered, but I knew I had faced them and won. And that was enough. Hey everyone, I'm Josh, 23 years old, living the typical mundane life. You know the drill, 9-5 office job, decent paycheck, but nothing to write home about. I had a bit of disposable income and a curiosity that sometimes got the better of me. I wasn't into anything too crazy, but the darker corners of the internet always intrigued me. The dark web, in particular, was this mysterious frontier that I couldn't help but explore every now and then. So, one evening after a particularly boring day at work, I found myself down that rabbit hole again. Browsing through random listings and forums, I came across this guy who seemed to be selling all sorts of fascinating robotic figures. They weren't just your run-of-the-mill toys either. These were high-tech drones and robots that seemed almost too good to be true. The seller, who went by the alias MechMaster23, had a sleek, professional-looking page, complete with glowing reviews and pictures of his products in action. I've always had a thing for gadgets and tech. Growing up, I was that kid who took apart his toys just to see how they worked. Now, with a bit of money to spare, my inner child was practically screaming at me to buy one of these robots. The more I scrolled, the more I was convinced that this was just the kind of quirky, cool thing I needed to spice up my otherwise dull evenings. To be honest, it felt like a no-brainer at the time. What's the harm in a little indulgence, right? But there was something a bit off about the whole thing. A subtle creepiness I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the robots were almost too lifelike. Or maybe it was the eerie silence of the forum thread where people posted their reviews. They all seemed happy, but there was an underlying tension in their words, a hint that they might have seen or experienced something they couldn't quite explain. I brushed off the unease, attributing it to my overactive imagination. After all, the dark web was bound to have a certain level of creepiness to it. It was part of the allure, part of what made it so intriguing. I clicked through the listings, examining each robot in detail. There were surveillance drones with night vision, humanoid figures with articulate limbs, and even tiny insect-like bots that could crawl into the smallest spaces. The possibilities seemed endless. One particular item caught my eye, a sleek black drone with a compact design and an impressive array of features. It had a built-in camera, advanced navigation systems, and even a little claw for grabbing small objects. It was called the Night Stalker. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't deny how cool it looked. The seller's description claimed it was perfect for hobbyists and tech enthusiasts alike, a versatile gadget that could provide hours of entertainment. I was sold. My curiosity had turned into obsession. The idea of owning something so unique and high-tech was too tempting to resist. I made a mental note to dig a bit deeper into MechMaster23's reputation before making any hasty decisions. For now, I closed my laptop, but the image of the Night Stalker lingered in my mind. Little did I know, that simple decision to browse the dark web that night would lead me down a path far darker and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. As I lay in bed, my mind kept wandering back to the drone. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just a harmless toy. But deep down, a part of me knew that I was about to get involved in something far beyond my understanding, something that would blur the lines between fascination and fear. The next few days were a blur of routine and restlessness. My thoughts kept drifting back to the Night Stalker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to have it. Work felt even more tedious than usual, and every free moment I got, I found myself researching more about MechMaster23. The reviews were all positive, but they lacked detail, almost like they were written by the same person. Despite this, my curiosity won out over caution. One evening, after another mind-numbing day at the office, I decided to take the plunge. I fired up my laptop, navigated to the dark web marketplace, and found MechMaster23's page again. There it was, the Night Stalker, staring back at me with its sleek black design and ominous name. My heart raced with excitement as I clicked on the purchase button. Bitcoin was the only accepted payment method, of course. I had dabbled in cryptocurrency before, so transferring the required amount was a breeze. As the transaction processed, a strange sense of exhilaration washed over me. It felt like I was crossing a threshold, venturing into uncharted territory. The confirmation email arrived almost immediately, along with a message from MechMaster23. Thank you for your purchase. Your order will be shipped within 48 hours. Enjoy your new toy. The word toy seemed out of place, given the sophisticated nature of the Night Stalker. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to a quirky sense of humor. I didn't tell anyone about my purchase. It felt like my little secret, a private indulgence that no one else needed to know about. After all, how many people could say they owned a state-of-the-art drone from the dark web? True to his word, MechMaster23 shipped the drone promptly. I received a tracking number that, unsurprisingly, didn't work on any conventional courier websites. The package was supposed to arrive in 3 to 5 days, and I found myself checking my mailbox obsessively, like a kid waiting for a Christmas present. The wait was agonizing. I distracted myself with work, video games, and scrolling through social media, but my mind kept drifting back to the Night Stalker. I imagined all the things I could do with it, filming aerial shots, spying on my neighborhood, purely for fun, of course, and showing it off to my friends. It would be the ultimate conversation starter. Finally, on the 4th day, I came home to find a plain brown box sitting on my doorstep. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, and the tape sealing it shut was almost industrial in its toughness. There was no return address, no markings of any kind, just a simple, unassuming package. I carried it inside, my hands trembling with excitement. Setting it on the kitchen table, I grabbed a knife and carefully sliced through the tape. The box opened with a faint creak, revealing layers of bubble wrap and packing peanuts. Nestled in the center was the Night Stalker, looking even more impressive in person. It was sleek, black, and almost menacing in its design. Alongside the drone was a small handwritten note. "Handle with care. Follow the instructions." I found the instructions buried beneath more packing material. They were surprisingly detailed, explaining everything from the initial setup to the various features of the drone. I spent the next few hours assembling it, my excitement growing with each step. The drone hummed to life with a soft whir, its lights blinking in a mesmerizing pattern. I took it for a test flight around my apartment, marveling at how responsive and agile it was. The built-in camera provided crystal clear footage, and the little claw worked flawlessly. It was everything I had hoped for, and more. I felt a rush of satisfaction, convinced that I had made a great purchase. Over the next few days, the Night Stalker became my new obsession. I flew it around the neighborhood, capturing stunning aerial shots and experimenting with its various features. It was the perfect way to unwind after a long day at work. Little did I know, my innocent fascination was about to take a dark turn, plunging me into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The following days were a whirlwind of excitement and fascination. The Night Stalker exceeded all my expectations. I spent every free moment tinkering with it, exploring its capabilities and pushing it to its limits. It was an incredible piece of technology, unlike anything I had ever seen. The drone's agility and responsiveness were almost uncanny, and the camera's clarity was breathtaking. It felt like I had my own personal spy, capable of capturing every detail of the world around me. I began to take the Night Stalker on more adventurous flights. I flew it around the neighborhood, taking in the scenery from angles I had never seen before. I explored nearby parks, buzzing over treetops and skimming the surface of ponds. The drone's stealthy design allowed it to go unnoticed, making me feel like I was in control of a top-secret gadget. The thrill was intoxicating. One evening, I decided to push the boundaries even further. There was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town that had always intrigued me. It was a crumbling relic from a bygone era, shrouded in mystery and urban legends. People said it was haunted, but I had never believed in such things. Armed with my Night Stalker, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to capture some eerie footage, and maybe even solve the mystery of the old factory. I drove out to the factory just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. The building loomed in the distance, its windows dark and empty. I parked my car a safe distance away and set up my drone, my hands shaking with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The Night Stalker lifted off smoothly, its lights flickering as it ascended into the twilight sky. I guided it towards the factory, the camera feed streaming to my phone with perfect clarity. The building looked even more foreboding up close, its walls covered in graffiti and vines. I maneuvered the drone through broken windows and down dark hallways, capturing every shadowy corner. The footage was incredible, like something out of a horror movie. I was completely engrossed, barely noticing the passing time. As the drone explored the depths of the factory, I stumbled upon something strange. In one of the larger rooms, there were crates and equipment that looked out of place in such a derelict building. The crates were marked with symbols I didn't recognize, and the equipment seemed oddly sophisticated. My heart raced as I hovered the drone closer, trying to get a better look. What was this stuff doing here? Suddenly, the drone's camera feed cut out, plunging my screen into darkness. Panic set in as I frantically tried to regain control. The Night Stalker was unresponsive, its signal lost. I cursed under my breath, my mind racing with possibilities. Had the battery died? Had I flown it out of range? Or was there something more sinister at play? I packed up my gear and drove home, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. I replayed the footage I had captured, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The crates, the equipment, the eerie atmosphere. It all felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a grave mistake. The next morning, I woke up to find the drone back on my doorstep. It was neatly packed in its original box, looking untouched. My heart skipped a beat as I inspected it. How had it gotten here? Who had returned it? There were no answers, only more questions. The handwritten note from Mechmaster 23 flashed through my mind. Handle with care. Follow the instructions. What had I gotten myself into? Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to dig deeper. I connected the drone to my laptop and reviewed the footage frame by frame, searching for any clues. But the more I watched, the more uneasy I felt. There was something wrong with the way the drone had been returned, something that didn't add up. My curiosity had led me into uncharted territory, and I was beginning to realize just how dangerous that could be. The following day, as I was flying the Night Stalker around my apartment, I noticed something strange. The drone seemed to be malfunctioning, its movements erratic and unpredictable. The camera feed flickered, showing glimpses of static and strange images. My heart pounded as I tried to regain control, but it was no use. The drone had a mind of its own. Suddenly, the Night Stalker shot towards the window, smashing through the glass and disappearing into the night. I stood there, stunned and terrified. What had I unleashed? The sense of excitement and adventure that had once filled me was replaced by a growing dread. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. I was in over my head. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow in the corner of my eye set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The Night Stalker's sudden departure through my window had left me rattled, and I had no idea where the drone had gone or who might have it now. My curiosity had led me into a nightmare, and I was desperate for answers. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I was jolted awake by the sound of sirens outside my building. The red and blue lights cast eerie shadows on my walls, and a sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I stumbled to the window, peeking through the blinds. My heart dropped. Police cars and unmarked vehicles were swarming the street. Men in tactical gear were moving swiftly, their faces grim and determined. Before I could process what was happening, there was a loud pounding on my door. "Open up! This is the FBI!" The words sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind raced, trying to understand why they were here. I hadn't done anything wrong. At least, nothing that warranted this kind of response. The pounding grew louder, more insistent. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The next thing I knew, I was being shoved to the ground, my hands pulled behind my back and cuffed. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, reading me my rights as they searched my apartment. I was in shock, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "What's going on?" I managed to stammer, but no one answered. I was hauled to my feet and led outside, the cool night air hitting my face. My neighbors had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. The flashing lights and the presence of armed officers had drawn everyone out of their apartments. I could see the concern in their eyes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. As I was shoved into the back of a police car, the reality of my situation began to sink in. This was real. This was happening. The ride to the station was a blur. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to piece together what could have led to this. The night stalker, the abandoned factory, the strange equipment. None of it made sense. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear growing with each passing moment. At the station, I was led into a sterile interrogation room and left to wait. The minutes felt like hours, and my anxiety grew with each tick of the clock. Finally, the door opened, and 2 agents walked in, their expressions stern and unyielding. They sat across from me, laying out a file thick with documents and photos. "Mr. Thompson," one of them began, "do you know why you're here?" I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "No, I don't. I haven't done anything wrong." The agent exchanged a look with his partner before turning back to me. "We have reason to believe that the drone you purchased and have been using, the Night Stalker, is involved in illegal activities. Specifically, we found evidence that it was equipped with explosives and surveillance equipment used for espionage." My blood ran cold. "What? No, that's impossible. I bought it from a guy on the dark web. It was just a toy. A high-tech toy, but still just a toy." The agent leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "We found the drone at an abandoned factory rigged with explosives. It's a miracle no one was hurt. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in?" I was stunned, my mind reeling. "I swear, I didn't know anything about explosives. I just bought it because it seemed cool. I have the transaction records, the messages from the seller. I can show you everything." The agents listened as I explained everything, from my initial curiosity to the purchase and the strange occurrences that followed. I handed over my laptop, showing them the messages and the transaction history. They scrutinized every detail, their expressions unreadable. Hours passed, and I was left alone in the room, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Finally, the door opened again, and the agents returned. Their demeanor had softened slightly, but the gravity of the situation was still palpable. "Mr. Thompson," the lead agent said, "we've reviewed your evidence. It appears you were indeed unaware of the drone's true nature. However, this is a serious matter, and there will be an ongoing investigation. You're free to go for now, but we advise you to stay away from the dark web and be more cautious in the future." I was released with a stern warning and a lingering sense of dread. The experience had shaken me to my core, and I knew that my life would never be the same. As I walked out of the station, the early morning light casting long shadows on the pavement, I couldn't help but reflect on how a simple curiosity had led me down such a dark and dangerous path. The message was clear. The dark web was not a playground. It was a realm of secrets and dangers, where even the most innocent-seeming purchase could have devastating consequences. I vowed to stay away from it, and I hoped my story would serve as a warning to others. Curiosity might lead to discovery, but sometimes it also leads to a darkness from which there is no easy escape. The weeks that followed my release were a mix of relief and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still watching me. My once beloved Night Stalker now felt like a ghost, haunting me with memories of how close I had come to disaster. Every night I triple-checked my locks and peered through the blinds, half expecting to see agents or something far worse lurking outside. Returning to my mundane life was harder than I expected. My co-workers noticed the change in me, the way I jumped at loud noises, the shadows under my eyes from sleepless nights. I brushed off their concerns with excuses about stress and insomnia. But inside I was a mess. The whole experience had left me scarred, a constant reminder of how easily curiosity could lead to danger. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the gravity of what had happened finally hit me. I realized how lucky I was to have gotten out unscathed. how close I had come to being wrongly accused of something horrific. The thought made me shudder. I decided it was time to do something productive with my experience, to turn my cautionary tale into a warning for others. I logged onto Reddit, my go-to platform for sharing stories and seeking advice. With a deep breath, I began to type out my story, detailing every step of my journey, from the initial allure of the dark web to the terrifying night of my arrest. I spared no detail, hoping that my experience would serve as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in the hidden corners of the internet. Sharing my story felt like a step towards closure, a way to make sense of the chaos that had upended my life. The responses poured in, messages of support, shared experiences, and gratitude for the warning. It was comforting to know that my story might help others avoid the same pitfalls. Over time, the nightmares faded and the paranoia lessened. I learned to move on, but the lesson remained etched in my mind. Curiosity may lead to discovery, but it can also lead to darkness and danger. The dark web, with its tantalizing allure, was a realm best left untouched. I had paid the price for my curiosity, and I hoped that sharing my experience would prevent others from making the same mistake. Life slowly returned to normal, but I was forever changed. My fascination with the dark web was gone, replaced by a healthy respect for the unknown. And while I still loved gadgets and tech, I now approached them with a newfound caution. The world was full of wonders, but it was also full of shadows, and I had learned the hard way to tread carefully in the dark.